On our 20th wedding anniversary, my husband stood at the end of the dining table I had spent all afternoon setting, looked at the candles I hadn't lit yet, and told me he had someone else more important tonight. He didn't say it cruelly. That would have at least been honest. He said it the way he talked about flight delays or market fluctuations, mildly inconvenienced. Already halfway out the door. His coat was still in his hand. His phone buzzed once, and he glanced at it before he glanced at me. The china I had taken out was the set we received as a wedding gift 20 years ago. I had polished each plate. I had folded the napkins the way my mother taught me. 2 decades of marriage arranged in symmetrical place settings. He didn't notice. "I have to get to the airport," Nathan said. "It's urgent. I'll explain later." He didn't. The front door closed softly. Not slammed. Not dramatic. Just final. I stood there in a house filled with unlit candles, watching 20 years of marriage fall into a silence so complete I could hear the refrigerator hum. I didn't cry. I didn't call him back. I walked to my desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a binder he had signed years ago without reading. He believed he was flying toward a new beginning. He didn't know something else had already begun. The house smelled like roasted rosemary chicken and extinguished anticipation. I blew out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and checked my phone, not to call him. But because a nurse's reflex doesn't disappear just because her marriage is cracking, you monitor what changes. That was when the notification appeared. Corporate credit card charge. International business class. One way. Destination. Paris. Passenger name. Jennifer Collins. 39. Business consultant. Strategic expansion advisor. According to Nathan, the woman he once told me was essential to securing European investors. I stared at her name for a long time. I work as a licensed nurse at one of the largest hospitals in Chicago. I have held pressure on bleeding wounds. I have told families the truth when machines could no longer lie for them. I have learned that when something destabilizes, panic only makes it worse. You assess, you verify. You act when the numbers confirm what your instincts already know. 20 years with Nathan had trained me to adjust. He was decisive, ambitious, a commercial real estate entrepreneur who built his company from one leased office into a regional firm managing multi-million-dollar developments. He moved fast. He took risks. He spoke in projections and percentages. I translated his speed into stability. If he bought property, I balanced budgets at home. If he leveraged capital, I managed the quiet details, insurance renewals, tax documentation, joint accounts, estate planning. I believed partnership meant reinforcement. What I didn't realize was that I had slowly become insulation. He made the decisions. I absorbed the consequences. I walked back into the dining room and looked at the 2 plates still facing each other. I imagined him at the airport, messaging Jennifer. I imagined champagne already waiting in some airport lounge. I didn't picture romance. I pictured expense classifications. Years ago, when Nathan's company began expanding aggressively, our family attorney recommended restructuring our assets. There were liability concerns, investor expectations, fiduciary obligations. We drafted a post-nuptial agreement and created a jointly governed trust to protect shared holdings. Nathan signed it in less than 5 minutes. "It's just paperwork," he'd said. "I trust you." Trust was convenient when it didn't require attention. I carried the binder to the table and sat down where he had stood minutes earlier. I flipped to the tab I had marked long ago, not because I expected to use it, but because I always prepare for worst-case scenarios. The clause was simple in its language and devastating in its potential. If either spouse used jointly governed funds or trust-linked corporate capital for undisclosed personal ventures without written acknowledgement from the co-trustee, enforcement measures could be initiated. Temporary suspension of representative authority. Mandatory compliance review. Dual approval requirements reinstated on restricted accounts. It did not mention infidelity. It did not require emotional proof. It required documentation. I opened my laptop and logged into the shared oversight portal we both technically controlled, but he rarely expected me to check. The Paris ticket had been charged to the International Development Fund, not his personal account. That fund was partially collateralized by assets tied to our trust. My name was on it. Another pending transfer caught my attention, larger, routed through an affiliated holding entity connected to a Florida commercial project he'd been negotiating. The timing was tight. Liquidity commitments were required within days. He hadn't just left dinner. He had exposed shared financial structure without disclosure. My phone buzzed again. A text from Nathan. Everything's moving fast. This changes everything. I read it twice. He thought Paris would change everything. He didn't realize everything had already changed the moment he walked out of our house. I closed the laptop slowly. Not because I was unsure. Because I understood permanence. I went back to the dining room and lit one candle. Just one. The flame flickered against the glass. 20 years of marriage had not exploded. There had been no screaming. No broken plates. No dramatic confession. Just a sentence. Just a door closing. Just a transaction record. I blew out the single candle and let the room return to darkness. Tomorrow, I would verify every number. Tonight, I would not chase him. For the first time in 20 years, I would not adjust. And somewhere over the Atlantic, my husband was raising a glass, believing he was stepping into a new future. He had no idea he had just stepped into a structure he no longer controlled. I didn't sleep the night after he left for Paris. The house felt different, like it had shifted on its foundation. Not louder, not emptier, just exposed. I walked through the kitchen before sunrise, past the untouched anniversary cake, and poured myself coffee I didn't taste. 20 years of marriage had taught me how to absorb disruption quietly. Nathan worked late. Nathan traveled. Nathan carried pressure. I filled the silence around him like insulation. That was our rhythm. But this wasn't work. This was departure. By the time I drove to the hospital for my shift, the city of Chicago was still dim and gray. The skyline looked steady, indifferent. I parked in the employee garage and sat for a moment with my hands on the steering wheel. I had replayed his words all night. I have someone else more important tonight. Not defensive, not angry, just factual, like he was rescheduling a meeting. Inside the ICU, monitors beeped in steady intervals. Ventilators hummed. Patients relied on structure to survive. Protocol, oversight, documentation. When something destabilized, we didn't panic. We followed systems. That thought stayed with me. During my lunch break, I opened my phone. I hadn't checked social media the night before. I didn't need confirmation of what I already knew. But there it was. Jennifer had posted a photo from Charles de Gaulle Airport. Champagne flutes. A blurred figure beside her that didn't need a face to be identified. Caption: New beginnings. My throat didn't tighten. My eyes didn't burn. What surprised me most was the absence of shock. Nathan had introduced Jennifer months ago as a strategic consultant for European expansion. She was articulate, ambitious, confident in rooms full of investors. I had met her twice at company events. She had looked at me with polite curiosity, as if assessing a variable in an equation she didn't fully understand. I had trusted Nathan's narrative. I went back to the nurses' station and logged into the hospital's internal system. I checked medication charts, updated notes, followed protocols. Every action documented, every change traceable. Transparency wasn't optional in my world. That evening, when my shift ended, I drove home and sat in the quiet living room. Our wedding photo hung above the fireplace. 2 younger versions of us smiling into a future that felt solid. Nathan had built his real estate investment firm from a small brokerage into a mid-sized commercial operation across the Midwest and Southeast. He was proud of it. I was proud of him. But growth changes dynamics. Years ago, when the company crossed into multi-state development deals, his attorney recommended restructuring their asset framework. There were tax considerations, liability exposure, investor expectations. We had met downtown in a glass-walled conference room with a corporate attorney who spoke in careful language about risk mitigation and trust structures. Nathan had been impatient. "It's standard," he had said. "Just protective paperwork." I remembered flipping through pages while he checked emails. I remembered asking about fiduciary responsibilities tied to joint assets. I remembered the attorney explaining that if either party used shared funds for undisclosed personal ventures, protective mechanisms could be triggered. Nathan had signed without hesitation. He trusted momentum more than clauses. That memory returned as I opened my laptop at home and logged into our shared financial oversight portal. As co-trustee on the development fund, I had limited access, not operational control. But visibility, I wasn't looking for proof of betrayal. I was looking for patterns. The Paris ticket charge was obvious. Business class. International development account. But that wasn't what caught my attention. There was a secondary pending transfer, labeled under a consulting retention structure tied to a newly formed limited liability company in Florida. The name meant nothing to me at first glance. I clicked deeper. The Florida entity was associated with a coastal commercial property project Nathan had mentioned casually at dinner a few months ago. He had described it as a smart leverage move. Projected European expansion revenue had been cited in investor summaries to justify aggressive capital positioning for that acquisition. I leaned back in my chair. If expansion numbers were inflated or dependent on informal consulting relationships, the exposure wasn't emotional. It was structural. I pulled up transaction histories from the past 6 months. Several smaller transfers categorized as advisory retainers had moved through layered entities before landing in accounts linked to Jennifer's consulting firm. Not illegal. Not blatant. But undisclosed to me? The clause didn't require infidelity. It required financial transparency. I closed my eyes and let the realization settle. He hadn't just started a new relationship. He had begun constructing a parallel future using shared infrastructure. I printed the transaction logs. I saved email confirmations. I noted timestamps. I didn't call him. I didn't text. Later that night, another notification appeared. Instagram again. A rooftop view of Paris. The Eiffel Tower lit in the distance. Building something extraordinary. Jennifer wrote. I studied the image closely. Nathan's company card rested beside the champagne bottle. Partially visible. Careless. Confident? I set my phone down. This wasn't about humiliation. This was about risk. For 20 years, I had believed that loyalty meant standing behind him no matter what direction he ran. I had interpreted silence as strength, patience as love, but sitting there in the dim kitchen light, anniversary candles still boxed on the counter, I understood something different. In medicine, when a system shows signs of failure, you intervene early. You don't wait for collapse. Nathan believed Paris was a beginning. He didn't realize he had just introduced instability into a structure I had helped build. I opened the binder after midnight. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if it understood something irreversible had already begun. I sat at my desk with the lamp angled low and slid the post-nuptial agreement out from its sleeve. The tabs were still where I had placed them years ago. Yellow markers. Margins filled with notes in my handwriting. I hadn't created the document out of fear. I had created it out of habit. Nurses prepare for complications. We don't wait for them. Nathan had signed it in under 5 minutes. I remembered the conference room downtown. Glass walls. Polished table. His phone vibrating while the attorney explained fiduciary responsibilities and asset exposure. We're expanding into multi-state development. The attorney had said, You need structure. Nathan had leaned back in his chair. Confident. Restless. Just protect us, he told the attorney. Standard stuff. It wasn't standard. The attorney had outlined scenarios neither of us believed would apply. Misuse of joint funds. Undisclosed capital allocation. Personal ventures entangled with shared collateral. He spoke in calm legal language about protective enforcement mechanisms. I asked questions. Nathan skimmed. When it came time to sign, He barely glanced at the clause regarding joint asset misuse. If either party utilizes trust-linked or jointly governed funds for non-disclosed personal financial ventures without written acknowledgement from the co-trustee, enforcement procedures may be initiated. Temporary suspension of representative authority. Mandatory compliance review. Dual authorization reinstated. It didn't mention affairs. It didn't need to. I flipped to that page now and traced my finger over the line he had initialed. His signature sat bold at the bottom. Confident. Certain. He had trusted momentum more than documentation. I set the binder beside my laptop and logged into the corporate oversight dashboard again. The Paris transfer was no longer pending. It had cleared. Another transaction had moved overnight. A larger wire, routed through the Florida holding entity I had identified earlier. It was categorized as a consulting capital allocation under projected European partnership development. Projected, not contracted. I opened the internal project summary Nathan had once forwarded to me casually, assuming I wouldn't study it. The Florida development required immediate liquidity confirmation to secure zoning priority. Investor summaries referenced anticipated European expansion revenue to justify leverage ratios. Jennifer's advisory projections were embedded in those numbers. My stomach tightened, not with jealousy, but with calculation. If European expansion faltered, projected returns collapsed. If projected returns collapsed, leverage ratios shifted. If leverage ratios shifted, collateral exposure expanded. Some of that collateral was tied to assets held in the joint trust, including our home. I sat back slowly. This wasn't reckless romance. This was structural risk layered over emotional betrayal. An automated notification blinked at the top of my screen. Compliance anomaly detected. Review recommended. I stared at it. Someone else was watching. The system had flagged multi-account movement across linked entities. That meant internal oversight software had triggered an alert. Possibly the CFO. Possibly the board's risk committee. If they initiated a review before I did, the process would unfold without my control. Timing mattered. I pulled up the enforcement portal attached to the trust documentation. The procedure was clear. Submit evidence of undisclosed joint fund usage. Specify accounts. Attach supporting documentation. Authentication required. Once submitted, enforcement triggered an automatic compliance hold on designated funds pending review. It would not be subtle. I checked the time. 11:38 p.m. My phone buzzed. A message from Nathan. Paris is incredible. Meetings tomorrow. This changes everything. I imagined him in a hotel overlooking the Seine, convinced he was expanding his empire. I imagined Jennifer beside him, confident that she was stepping into something stable. I clicked on her latest post. They were on a balcony. Champagne again. The Eiffel Tower in the background. New beginnings. She had written earlier. Now the caption read, Building something global. I zoomed in on the image. Nathan's company card lay on the table between them. I closed the photo. He believed he was constructing a future. He didn't realize he was violating a structure. I reopened the binder and read the clause one more time. Not to convince myself. To confirm. No written acknowledgement from co-trustee. Documented transfers. Jointly governed fund. The evidence was clean. I uploaded transaction logs. Email confirmations. The project summary referencing European projections. I attached the consulting payment breakdown tied to Jennifer's firm. My hands didn't shake. This wasn't about punishment. It was about containment. I paused before entering the authentication code. Once submitted, the process could not be quietly undone. It would trigger review. It would create record. It would limit his authority. I thought about 20 years of adjusting, 20 years of smoothing over investor dinners, of explaining his absences to friends, of absorbing the tension that followed every ambitious leap. He had once told me, half laughing, "You don't really understand leverage." I understood leverage. I understood exposure. And I understood when a system required intervention. My phone buzzed again. "Trust me," he wrote. "This is bigger than us." I typed nothing. Instead, I entered the authentication code and pressed submit. The screen refreshed. Request received. Compliance hold pending review? No fireworks. No alarm. Just documentation. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The house was still silent. The anniversary candles remained untouched on the dining table. Somewhere in Paris, my husband was raising a glass to a future he believed he controlled. He didn't realize he had just triggered the only mechanism he had never bothered to read. The ventilator alarm went off at 2:17 in the morning, and I silenced it with steady hands. The patient stabilized within minutes. Blood pressure corrected. Oxygen levels returned to baseline. In the ICU, systems either hold or they don't. If they fail, you intervene before collapse becomes irreversible. By the time my shift ended, the sky over Chicago was the color of cold steel. I sat in the staff lounge scrolling through my phone. And there it was again, Jennifer's latest post from Paris. A balcony overlooking the Seine. Crystal glasses catching city light. Caption: expansion. Freedom. Momentum. Nathan's hand was visible this time, wrapped loosely around a champagne flute. On the table between them, partially obscured but unmistakable, was the corporate card linked to the International Development Fund. My stomach didn't drop. It sharpened. I zoomed in on the image. The card number was blurred by glare, but the embossed logo was clear. The same logo that appeared on the oversight dashboard I had opened the night before. My phone vibrated again. Email notification. Subject line: International wire authorization, pending review. I opened it. The amount was larger than the flight. Much larger. Routed through the same international development account. Earmarked as consulting advancement for European strategic positioning. No secondary authorization attached. No co-trustee acknowledgement. I closed my eyes briefly and counted backward from 5. The way I do before delivering difficult news to a family. When I got home, I didn't take off my shoes. I walked straight to my desk, opened the binder again, and turned to the enforcement page. The language was precise. If joint funds were used for undisclosed personal ventures without written acknowledgement, protective enforcement could be initiated. Temporary suspension of representative authority. Compliance review. Reinstatement of dual approval requirements. No mention of affairs. No reference to morality. Only structure. I picked up my phone and called the family attorney's office. Not Nathan's corporate counsel. Not the board. I asked for the senior assistant who had helped draft our documents years ago. Hypothetically, I said, keeping my voice level, if a co-trustee observed unauthorized use of jointly governed funds tied to expansion capital, what would enforcement trigger? There was a pause. Once filed, she said carefully. Compliance lock would activate. The financial institution would flag affected accounts. A review process would begin. It would be documented. Reversible. Only through joint acknowledgement and board notification. It becomes part of governance record. In other words, it would not be private. I thanked her and ended the call. On my screen, the Florida acquisition memo was still open. Liquidity confirmation was required within days to secure the commercial waterfront development Nathan had been pursuing for months. He had spoken about it at dinner with excitement, outlining projected returns tied to anticipated European capital inflows. If the European capital was frozen, the Florida leverage would destabilize. This was no longer a marital wound. This was structural exposure. My inbox refreshed. Another internal notification, automated compliance flag, triggered due to multi-account activity variance. The CFO had requested clarification on the classification of international consulting transfers. He wasn't the only one watching. If the board initiated review before I acted, I would lose control of timing. I stared at the enforcement portal open in another tab. Username. Password. Multi-factor authentication ready. I glanced at the clock on my laptop. 11:38 p.m. Me. The anniversary candles were still in their box on the counter. My phone buzzed again. A message from Nathan. Things are moving fast. This changes everything. He believed momentum was on his side. I opened the transaction log once more and reviewed the evidence line by line. Corporate fund usage. No documented acknowledgement. Pending secondary wire. This wasn't suspicion. It was record. I entered the authentication code sent to my phone. The enforcement portal prompted me to upload documentation. I attached transaction records, timestamp confirmations, screenshots of the wire authorization request. My cursor hovered over the submit button. Another buzz. A live story notification? Jennifer had posted again, this time tagging Nathan's company location in Paris. Public association. Reputational exposure layered over financial risk. I exhaled slowly and clicked submit. The screen refreshed. Request under review, compliance lock pending. No fireworks. No sound. Just confirmation. I closed the laptop gently. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Nathan was likely toasting expansion. He didn't know the compliance lock would activate as soon as the banking institution processed the enforcement flag. He didn't know that accounts he assumed were fluid would require dual authorization by morning. He didn't know that a system he once dismissed as paperwork was now operational. I walked into the dining room and sat at the same table where he had stood days earlier. The house was silent again. Not fragile this time. Intentional. My phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. Corporate banking division. I let it ring once before answering. Mrs. Collins. The representative said, formal and neutral. We've received a co-trustee enforcement request. International development accounts are temporarily flagged for review pending documentation verification. Understood. I replied, certain disbursements may be delayed. That's fine. When I ended the call, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Not anger. Relief. For 20 years, I had adjusted to protect momentum. I had absorbed impact so Nathan could keep moving forward without friction. Tonight, I allowed friction. He believed Paris was the beginning of something new. He didn't realize he had just triggered the first lock. The first notification came at 6:14 in the morning. International transfer pending review. Status changed to compliance hold. I was standing in my kitchen in Chicago, still in scrubs, coffee cooling in my hand. The house felt suspended, as if it were waiting for impact. I didn't react. I had expected the hold to trigger within 12 hours of submission. The system was efficient when documentation was clean. A second alert followed. Associated Development Fund temporarily restricted pending trustee verification. I set my coffee down and opened the oversight dashboard on my phone. The Florida holding entity now carried a red flag beside its liquidity line. The International Development account showed a review marker. It wasn't dramatic. It was procedural. In Paris. It was just past 1 in the afternoon. My phone rang. Nathan. I let it ring twice before answering. What did you do? He asked. His voice controlled but tight. I enforced what was already written, I replied. You triggered something. The bank just froze part of the expansion fund. It's under compliance review, I said. That's what the clause specifies. He exhaled sharply. This is a timing issue. We're closing investor meetings today. You used joint development capital for an undisclosed consulting venture, I said. Without written acknowledgement. It's not undisclosed. It's strategy. Then it should withstand review. There was silence on the line. In the background, I heard traffic and muffled conversation, hotel lobby noise. Maybe this is going to cause unnecessary noise, he said. You should have called me first. You were boarding a flight. That's not the point. It is. He lowered his voice. You don't understand how delicate this timing is. I looked at the notification still glowing on my screen. I understand exactly how timing works. He ended the call abruptly. I wasn't surprised. An hour later, another call came, not from him. The company's CFO, Ashley, he said carefully. We've had multiple accounts flagged under joint trustee review. I need clarification. I initiated a compliance verification under the trust agreement, I said evenly. Documentation supports the action. There was a pause. This affects the Florida acquisition. he added. Investors are expecting liquidity confirmation. Then they should appreciate transparency, I said. His tone shifted slightly. The board will likely request a formal review session. I expected that. After we ended the call, I checked my phone again. A new text from Nathan. They declined the company card at lunch. Another, we're working through it. Then one more. This is embarrassing. I imagined him stepping outside a private investor dinner in Paris, explaining away a card decline while Jennifer watched. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt inevitability. By mid-afternoon Chicago time, the oversight portal showed a second-level compliance marker. When multiple linked accounts are flagged simultaneously, the system escalates. That wasn't my decision. That was structure. I was finishing documentation on a patient discharge when my phone buzzed again. Jennifer had posted a new photo. The champagne glasses were gone. The caption had changed. Unexpected delays. Still optimistic. I studied the image. No visible company card this time. I wondered if she understood yet that optimism doesn't override fiduciary duty. Another call from Nathan came that evening. This time, his voice carried strain he couldn't conceal. The CFO says the board is calling an inquiry session, he said. They think there's misclassification. There is misclassification, I replied. It's consulting. It's undisclosed capital allocation tied to projected expansion revenue that hasn't materialized. You're making this sound criminal. I'm making it sound documented. He fell quiet. Did you really have to escalate it this far? He asked finally. I didn't escalate, I said. The numbers did? He exhaled again. Longer this time. You're risking the entire Florida deal. You risked it first. That landed? I could hear it in the way his breathing changed. Jennifer's firm is part of the expansion modeling, he said quickly, as if trying to regain control of the narrative. This was strategic positioning. Was it disclosed to me as co-trustee? Silence. Was it disclosed to the board before leverage ratios were presented? Another silence. In the background, I heard a door close. This was supposed to move us forward, he said. You moved, I answered. Without structure. After the call ended, I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for several minutes before driving home. The sun had set. The city lights flickered against the lake. Everything looked steady from a distance. When I walked into the house, the anniversary cake was still on the counter, the candles untouched. I opened my laptop and checked the dashboard again. A new notification blinked. Expanded review initiated due to multi-account anomaly. The Florida entity was now under provisional audit status. That meant external compliance oversight would likely be involved. This was no longer a quiet internal hold. It was documentation entering formal review channels. My phone buzzed once more. Nathan. He didn't start with accusation this time. We might need to cut the Paris trip short, he said. The board wants answers. I leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at the dark window reflecting my face. Then you should come home, I said. For this. For the structure you destabilized. He was quiet for a long moment. You're going to regret this if the company takes a hit, he said softly. I looked around the house at the framed photos. At the dining table still set for two. I regret not acting sooner, I replied. He didn't respond. After we hung up, I checked the portal one last time before shutting down for the night. The compliance hold had fully activated. International expansion funds frozen. Linked development accounts under review. Dual authorization reinstated. Paris had been meant to signal a new beginning. Instead, it became the first fracture. My phone started ringing at 5. Sure. Emon, I was already awake. Nurses don't sleep deeply. We rest in layers, always half alert. Always listening for alarms that might not even be ours. The screen lit up with the name of Nathan's CFO, Daniel Mercer. I let it ring twice before answering. Ashley, Daniel said without preamble, his voice tight but controlled. We have a problem. I assumed you might, I replied. There's a compliance hold on the international development account. The bank flagged it overnight. They're saying it was initiated by a co-trustee enforcement request. Silence hovered between us. Yes, I said. Daniel exhaled. Nathan is in Paris. We have scheduled meetings today. There are commitments on the table. I'm aware. The hold is affecting more than the European transfer, he continued. It's triggered a review of liquidity ratios tied to the Florida waterfront acquisition. I closed my eyes briefly. The waterfront project was Nathan's crown jewel. Mixed-use luxury towers along the river. Investors. Press coverage. Months of negotiation. How exposed are we? I asked. If the hold isn't lifted quickly, the lenders will require revised projections. That could delay closing. Delay? In Nathan's world? Delay meant vulnerability. And the board? I asked. They've been notified automatically due to the compliance variance. Of course they had. Daniel lowered his voice. Nathan is furious. He says this is a misunderstanding. I'm sure he does. He wants to know what you filed. I stood and walked to the kitchen window. The city was just beginning to wake. Gray light stretching over rooftops. I filed documentation consistent with our post-nuptial agreement, I said evenly. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Are you alleging misconduct? He asked carefully. I'm alleging unauthorized use of jointly governed funds. That's serious. It's documented. He exhaled again. Ashley, once this becomes formal record, it's not just about the two of you. Investors will scrutinize governance. I understand. And if they determine fiduciary breach? I understand, I repeated. We ended the call without resolution. 10 minutes later, Nathan called. I watched his name flash across my screen. Once? Twice. 3 times. I answered on the 4th. What did you do? He demanded. His voice wasn't calm. It wasn't strategic. It was stripped of polish. I enforced a clause, I said. You froze development capital over a consulting expense. You used joint funds without disclosure. It was strategic positioning, he snapped. Jennifer's firm is structuring European partnerships. With champagne on a balcony, I asked quietly. Silence. This isn't about her, he said sharply. It's about governance. You've just jeopardized a 9-figure project. No, I said. You did. He exhaled hard into the phone. I could hear traffic in the background. Paris was awake now. You don't understand leverage, he muttered. I understand exposure. He didn't respond. Instead, he changed tactics. Lift the hold, he said. We'll discuss this when I'm back. The hold triggers review. It's not lifted by conversation. You're overreacting. I filed evidence. You're humiliating me. I'm documenting you. The line went quiet. Finally, he said. Lower. Investors are asking questions. They've seen the Instagram posts. Of course they had. Public image intertwined with capital movement. A consultant tagged in foreign expansion photos while internal funds were locked. You made it public, I said. This is business. Then treat it like business. He hung up. By mid-morning, my inbox was full. Board compliance inquiry. Bank documentation request. A formal notice that certain executive authorizations were temporarily suspended pending review. Nathan's signature power was limited until co-trustee confirmation. I printed each email and placed them neatly in the binder. At noon, another call came, this time from the primary lender on the Florida waterfront project. Mrs. Collins, the representative said formally. We require updated capital confirmation before proceeding to final stage. I understand, I said, until compliance review is resolved. We will pause advancement. Pause. That word again. Momentum halted. Not destroyed. Just stopped. I drove to the hospital for my shift that afternoon and worked 12 hours without mentioning any of it to anyone. I inserted IV lines. I adjusted ventilator settings. I spoke softly to families in waiting rooms. Control, in my world, meant steadiness. Around 8 p.m., Daniel texted me. 2 investors requesting emergency governance meeting. Tomorrow, I replied with a single word. Understood. Later that night, another message appeared on my screen, this one from Jennifer. It surprised me. I think there's been some confusion, she wrote. Nathan says funds are temporarily delayed. We're working on restructuring. I stared at the word. Any contractual agreements between your firm and Nathan's company should be addressed through official channels. I typed back. Direct communication with me is unnecessary. She didn't respond. I imagined the hotel suite, the uncertainty creeping in, the realization that company cards weren't clearing, that wire confirmations weren't final, not because of drama, because of structure. At 10, 47 pages. Another email arrived. Subject: Temporary Executive Authority Adjustment. Effective immediately. All capital disbursements above a specified threshold required dual authorization from both trustees. Nathan no longer had unilateral power. I set my phone down and walked back into the dining room. The anniversary candles were still on the table. 20 of them. I lit one. Not for the marriage. For the moment. Across the ocean, Nathan was likely pacing in a foreign city. Recalculating. He believed I had attacked him. He hadn't yet understood that I had simply stopped cushioning his risks. And without cushioning, structures reveal their cracks. Nathan landed in Chicago on a gray Thursday afternoon. He didn't tell me he was coming home. I learned from the security notification on our driveway camera when his car pulled in just before 5. I was at the hospital finishing my shift when my phone buzzed with the alert. I stared at the still image of him stepping out of the car, same tailored coat, same controlled posture, but something about the way he paused before entering the house felt different. Not confident. Measured. By the time I got home, he was sitting at the dining table. The anniversary cake was gone. The candles were stacked neatly in a small box. He had cleaned the counter. Control through order. He looked up when I walked in. We need to talk, he said. I set my bag down carefully and took off my coat. We do... He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. That almost unsettled me more. The board has scheduled an emergency governance review, he said. They're bringing in external auditors. That's standard when compliance locks trigger, I replied. You knew it would escalate. I knew it would follow structure. He leaned forward, hands clasped. Do you understand what this does to market perception? I understand what undisclosed capital movement does to fiduciary credibility. His jaw tightened. You're speaking like a lawyer. I'm speaking like a co-trustee. Silence settled between us. I was building something, he said finally. The European positioning wasn't about her. It was about expansion. Then why wasn't it disclosed? He didn't answer immediately. Because timing matters, he said at last. You move first. You inform later. That's not governance, I said. That's gamble. He stood and began pacing slowly. The Florida acquisition depends on projected capital ratios, he said. If investors think there's instability, they pull. They already saw instability, I said. The system flagged it. That was internal. It's external now. He stopped pacing and faced me. You've created a perception crisis. I met his eyes. No, I said quietly. You created a structural one. He ran a hand through his hair. Frustration breaking through the calm surface. Jennifer's firm was modeling European yield projections, he said. It was legitimate consulting. Was it invoiced properly? I asked. Yes. Was it disclosed to me before funds were allocated? No. Was it disclosed to the board before leverage was presented? Another pause. No. That's why compliance escalated, I said. He exhaled hard and sat back down. This is going to get messy, he said. It already was. My phone buzzed on the counter. A message from an unknown number. Hi, Ashley. I think we need to talk. Jennifer? Nathan saw the name on the screen. She shouldn't be contacting you, he said immediately. She just did. He rubbed his forehead. This is turning personal. It was personal the moment you boarded that flight. I opened the message. I wasn't aware of the compliance issue until today. I don't want to be involved in something unethical. Can we speak? Interesting. I typed nothing. Nathan's phone rang. He glanced at the caller ID and hesitated. The board chair, he muttered, stepping into the living room to answer. I stayed at the table and opened the oversight dashboard again. Another update had posted, expanded audit scope, Florida holding entity. That meant external review had extended beyond the international fund. I could hear Nathan's voice from the other room, lower now. Defensive. Yes, no, it's procedural, yes. Ashley triggered the clause. No. There was no malicious intent. He was explaining. For once. When he came back, his composure had thinned. They're questioning leverage assumptions, he said. They think projected European returns were overstated. Were they? I asked. They were aggressive, he admitted. But that's how expansion works. Expansion works with transparency. He looked at me with something almost like disbelief. You've always supported my growth, he said. Why turn now? I supported ambition, I replied. Not exposure. He studied me for a long moment. You've changed, he said. No, I answered. I stopped adjusting. That landed heavier than I expected. His shoulders lowered slightly. They're reviewing Jennifer's firm too, he said. There are questions about overlapping advisory compensation. Was she paid separately outside the company structure? Yes. From what account? He hesitated. I didn't need the answer. He had layered personal and corporate lines until they blurred. Now compliance was separating them. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Jennifer. I didn't know the funds were joint governed. He said everything was cleared. Nathan saw the second notification. She doesn't understand governance, he said sharply. Neither did you, I replied. He didn't argue. Outside, the evening light faded completely. The house felt different now, not fragile, not tense. Transitional. The empire he thought he was expanding had become subject to review. Not because I exposed him publicly. Because I stopped absorbing risk quietly. Nathan looked at me again. Are you trying to destroy me? He asked. I held his gaze. No, I said. I'm allowing structure to operate. The difference was subtle. But it was irreversible. The emergency governance meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock Friday morning. Nathan left the house at 7. Dressed in a navy suit I had bought him years ago for his first major acquisition closing. He didn't ask if I was coming. He didn't need to. As co-trustee, my attendance had already been requested in the formal notice. The boardroom downtown felt colder than usual. Glass walls. Polished table. City skyline stretched behind it like a reminder of what was at stake. Daniel nodded at me when I entered. 2 external auditors sat near the end of the table. Laptops open. The board chair. Margaret Ellison greeted me with a measured expression. Nathan. Ashley, she said. Let's begin. No small talk. Margaret projected the compliance summary on the screen. On Tuesday evening, she began. A co-trustee enforcement request was submitted concerning international development funds. This triggered an automatic compliance lock and subsequent audit expansion. She looked at Nathan. Can you clarify the nature of the European consulting allocation? Nathan straightened in his chair. Jennifer Collins' firm was retained to model expansion projections for a potential Paris-based partnership, he said smoothly. The transfer covered advisory positioning and preliminary development costs. Margaret nodded once. Was this allocation disclosed to the co-trustee prior to execution? Nathan's jaw tightened. No. Was it disclosed to the board before projected leverage ratios were presented for the Florida waterfront acquisition? Silence stretched. No, he repeated. One of the auditors leaned forward. Our review indicates that projected European revenue was embedded in Florida leverage modeling. Without secured agreements, those projections constitute speculative capital. Speculative. Margaret turned to me. Ashley, what prompted your enforcement request? I kept my voice level. Undisclosed allocation of jointly governed funds tied to speculative projections that directly impacted collateral exposure, I said. I exercised the protective clause within our trust agreement. The room was silent for several seconds. Daniel cleared his throat. Had the compliance lock not triggered, he said carefully, lenders would have proceeded based on those projections. And if European expansion stalled, one auditor asked, liquidity strain. Daniel admitted. Margaret folded her hands. This is no longer about personal misconduct, she said. This is about fiduciary governance. Nathan shifted in his chair. I did not intend to mislead the board, he said. Timing required swift positioning. Positioning without disclosure is risk, Margaret replied. One of the auditors projected another document. Additionally, he said, we've identified overlapping advisory payments to Jennifer Collins' firm from a secondary holding account not previously reported in board summaries. Nathan's composure flickered. That was a consulting retainer, he said quickly. From which account? Margaret asked. He hesitated. The Lakeshore Advisory Reserve. I felt something tighten inside my chest. The Lakeshore Reserve was originally designated for contingency stabilization, an emergency buffer against market fluctuation. You used the contingency reserve for consulting, Daniel asked quietly. It was temporary, Nathan insisted. Short-term reallocation. The auditor's tone remained neutral. That reserve was part of the collateral comfort statement presented to lenders. The implications settled heavily across the table. Collateral reassurance had been partially depleted. Not publicly, but structurally. Margaret leaned back. This places us in a governance liability position, she said. Investor confidence depends on transparency. Nathan looked at me. This was strategic, he repeated. Softer now. It was unilateral, I replied. The meeting extended for nearly 2 hours. By the end, the board had voted unanimously to maintain the compliance lock pending full audit completion. All capital disbursements above a specified threshold required dual authorization. The Florida acquisition would remain paused until revised projections were validated without speculative European revenue. Temporary oversight committee appointed. External audit timeline established. Public disclosure drafted as a routine governance review. No mention of Paris. No mention of Jennifer. Structure protected itself. As we exited the boardroom, Nathan walked beside me but did not speak. In the elevator, he finally said, they're treating this like I committed fraud. They're treating it like you bypassed disclosure, I said. He exhaled slowly. Jennifer is already distancing herself, he added. Her firm sent a notice stating they were unaware of reserve sourcing. She's protecting her reputation, I replied. And you're protecting yours? He asked. I'm protecting governance. Outside the building, the wind off the lake cut sharp across the sidewalk. Nathan stopped walking. This could cost us the Florida deal, he said. It could cost you unilateral control, I corrected. He studied me with an expression I couldn't fully read, part anger, part realization. I built this company, he said. You built it with leveraged trust, I replied. Trust requires structure. He didn't answer. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. A final message from Jennifer. I've withdrawn from the Paris partnership discussion. I can't risk my firm's exposure. I didn't respond. An hour later, Nathan forwarded me a formal letter. European advisory engagement suspended pending audit resolution. Momentum had shifted. Not because of scandal, because of documentation. I sat alone at the dining table that night and opened the box of anniversary candles again. I lit 3 more. Not for celebration, for acknowledgement. Paris had promised expansion. Instead, it triggered review, and review had exposed more than either of them expected. The Florida lenders called on Monday morning. Nathan put the call on speaker in his home office while I stood in the doorway, listening. We've completed a preliminary review of the updated capital disclosures. The lead representative said, given the ongoing audit and revised leverage projections, we are modifying our position. Nathan's grip tightened on the edge of his desk. In what way? He asked. We are reducing the loan commitment pending stabilization of governance structure. Reducing? Not canceling. But close enough. Silence filled the office. What does that mean in numbers? Nathan asked. A significant percentage. The representative replied. We cannot proceed under previously assumed ratios. When the call ended, Nathan remained standing, staring at the blank wall. That waterfront deal was the keystone, he said quietly. Without it, the expansion narrative weakens. The narrative was built on projections that weren't secured, I replied. He turned toward me. You think I didn't know that? I think you believed momentum would outrun scrutiny. He didn't argue. Instead, he walked past me into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, hands steadier than his eyes. By noon, an internal memo circulated among senior staff. Temporary restructuring under governance review. The language was careful, but perception shifts faster than wording. Daniel called again that afternoon. 2 minority investors are requesting protective clauses, he said. They're worried about collateral stability. Nathan pressed his fingers against his temple. They're overreacting, he muttered. They're responding, I corrected. The house felt smaller that day. Not physically, financially. At 4 p.m, another notification appeared in my inbox. Subject: Lakeshore Advisory Reserve Audit Findings. I opened it. The contingency reserve had been drawn down more extensively than I realized. Multiple consulting allocations over the past quarter. Not just Paris. Chicago-based advisory firms. Private networking expenses. Strategic positioning dinners. None disclosed. All tied to projected expansion. I walked into Nathan's office and placed the printed report on his desk. He didn't look surprised. I was managing opportunity, he said. You were leveraging stability, I replied. It's how growth works. It's how exposure builds. He sat down heavily. I never thought you'd turn this into a formal challenge, he said. It became formal the moment reserve funds were redirected without disclosure. He looked up at me, something raw in his expression. Was this about her? He asked. It became about structure long before her. He didn't respond. That evening, Jennifer's name trended briefly in a niche business forum. Someone had connected her firm to the paused European expansion. Speculation followed. Not scandal, but doubt. She posted a statement within hours. Our firm values transparency and ethical governance. We are not involved in any fiduciary irregularities. Distance. Calculated and immediate. Nathan read the statement silently at the dining table. She's protecting her firm, he said flatly. She's protecting her leverage, I replied. The board scheduled a second review session for Wednesday. This one would determine executive authority moving forward. Temporary suspension had already limited Nathan's unilateral signing power. The next vote could formalize dual oversight permanently. That night, we sat across from each other in the living room. No television. No distraction. I never intended to destabilize the company, he said. I know. I thought if I secured Europe first, everything else would fall into place. You secured optics, I said. Not foundation. He leaned back, exhausted. Do you know what it feels like to have your own board question your judgment? Yes, I said quietly. For 20 years. That landed differently than the others. He didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He just looked at me. The next morning, a revised public statement was released. Florida acquisition under reevaluation due to internal governance recalibration. Recalibration. A polite word for contraction. Investors responded cautiously. The company stock dipped modestly, then stabilized. Not collapse. Containment. Jennifer withdrew entirely from European discussions. Her firm issued a formal disengagement letter. Nathan read it in silence. She's stepping away, he said. She has to. And if the board limits my authority permanently? He asked. Then you operate within structure. He shook his head slowly. You don't understand what that means. I understand accountability. He looked at me with something almost like realization. This isn't revenge. Is it? He asked. No, I said. It's alignment. By Wednesday afternoon, the board vote concluded. Executive authority remained, but with permanent dual authorization for high-level capital disbursement. The compliance hold on international expansion stayed in place pending full audit completion. The Florida project remained paused, not dead, but no longer guaranteed. When Nathan returned home that evening, he didn't go to his office. He sat at the dining table again, the same place where he had stood weeks earlier before boarding a flight to Paris. It's smaller now, he said quietly. The company? I asked. The illusion. I didn't respond. Outside, the city lights reflected off the lake. Structures hadn't collapsed. They had contracted, and in contraction, truth surfaced. The audit report arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Nathan was in his office when the email notification came through. I was in the kitchen reviewing patient schedules for the following week when I heard the sharp inhale from down the hall. It's final, he called out. I walked in slowly. He had the document open on his screen. Pages of formal language outlining findings, timelines, and governance adjustments. Read it, he said. I did. Unauthorized capital reallocation from the Lakeshore Contingency Reserve. Improper embedding of speculative European revenue into Florida leverage projections. Failure to disclose advisory payments to co-trustee and board prior to capital movement. No criminal misconduct, no fraud. But clear fiduciary breach of internal governance protocol. The recommendation section followed. Permanent dual authorization requirement for all executive-level capital transfers. Independent Oversight Committee for 12 months. Formal reprimand entered into board record. Nathan stared at the screen as if it were written in a language he didn't recognize. They're reducing my signing authority, he said. They're formalizing shared authority. I corrected. He didn't respond. They didn't remove me, he said quietly. They didn't need to. He leaned back in his chair. Do you understand what this does to perception? He asked. Yes. He turned toward me. I built this company from nothing, he said. Now every major move requires approval. Accountability isn't removal, I replied. It's structure. He let out a bitter half-laugh. You sound like the board. I sound like the trust agreement. He looked down at the printed copy on his desk. They cited the enforcement request as appropriate under Clause 13, he said. Your clause. It was ours, I replied. Later that evening, a formal internal announcement was circulated to senior leadership. Governance recalibration completed. Executive authority structure updated. The wording was diplomatic, but the impact was clear. Nathan's power had narrowed, not destroyed. Adjusted. At dinner, we sat across from each other again. No raised voices. No accusations. Just the quiet hum of consequence. Jennifer sent a final email, he said after a long silence. What did she say? She's formally terminating all advisory ties. Effective immediately. That's predictable. She said she can't risk reputational association during governance review. I met his eyes. She protected herself. He nodded slowly. I thought she believed in the vision. She believed in stability. He looked down at his plate. I misjudged that, he admitted. Outside, rain began tapping lightly against the windows. A steady, cleansing rhythm. Are you satisfied? He asked finally. The question hung in the air. I'm aligned, I said. That's not the same. No, I agreed. It isn't. He leaned back, exhaustion settling into his posture. I lost leverage, he said. You lost unilateral leverage, I replied. He studied me for a moment. And what did you gain? Balance. He didn't argue. The next morning, the lenders issued a revised conditional agreement. The Florida acquisition could proceed under reduced scale and adjusted collateral requirements. Smaller, safer. Nathan read the terms twice. They're scaling it back, he said. They're reducing exposure? I replied. He set the document down. This will take years to rebuild. Then rebuild it properly. He looked at me differently then, not with anger, not with accusation, with recognition. You knew this would happen, he said quietly. I knew structure would correct imbalance. And if I had told you before, Paris, he asked, I would have reviewed it with you. And if I hadn't gone, the numbers would still matter. He nodded slowly. For the first time since he boarded that flight, there was no defensiveness in his posture. Just reality. That evening, I walked into the dining room and gathered the remaining anniversary candles. There were 15 left unlit. I placed them back in the box. Nathan watched from the doorway. You're not celebrating? He said. I'm not mourning either. He stepped into the room. What happens now? He asked. Now, I said. We operate within structure. He considered that. No more unilateral moves, he said quietly. No more silent adjustments, I replied. The silence that followed felt different than the one that had filled the house weeks ago. Not tense. Not hollow. Grounded. Later that night, Nathan forwarded me the final audit confirmation email. He didn't add commentary. Just the document, I replied with a single line. Received. Across the city, investors recalibrated their expectations. In Paris, the expansion narrative faded. In Chicago, governance tightened. Nothing collapsed. But everything shifted. Nathan stood in the doorway of his office long after midnight, looking at the skyline. I didn't see this coming, he said. I knew. He never read the fine print. 3 weeks passed without a single emergency meeting. The house felt different. Not warmer. Not colder. Structured. Nathan no longer left before sunrise without saying where he was going. His calendar was shared. Major calls were scheduled with transparency. Documents that once moved across his desk unilaterally now required dual authorization, and he sent them to me without resistance. The Oversight Committee held its first monthly review on a Tuesday afternoon. I attended remotely from a quiet conference room at the hospital during my break. Daniel presented updated liquidity projections. The Florida waterfront project had been reduced in scale, fewer units, less leverage, more conservative timelines, safer, less impressive, more sustainable. Nathan spoke carefully during the meeting. He no longer framed projections as inevitabilities. He framed them as possibilities. That difference mattered. When the session ended, Margaret remained on the line. Ashley, she said, your enforcement request was disruptive, but it was appropriate. I nodded. Nathan is still capable, she continued. He simply needed guardrails. Guardrails. The word stayed with me long after the call ended. That evening, Nathan and I sat on the back patio overlooking the quiet street. Chicago's late summer air carried a faint warmth, the kind that lingers before autumn sharpens everything. I've been thinking, he said. I waited. I confused acceleration with progress. I didn't respond immediately. Acceleration feels powerful, he continued. Progress requires patience. You built acceleration, I said. I neglected foundation. The admission was quiet, but it didn't feel forced. He looked at me. You weren't trying to humiliate me. No. You were trying to prevent collapse. Yes. He exhaled slowly. I wish you had confronted me sooner. I wish you had invited me sooner. We let that settle. There were no apologies for Paris. No dramatic confessions. Just clarity. A few days later, Jennifer's firm officially removed all references to Nathan's company from their website portfolio. The European expansion narrative faded into a line item in archived board minutes. No scandal. Just recalibration. At the hospital, my shifts continued unchanged. I adjusted medications. I monitored vitals. I reassured families. Structure held. At home. Structure held too. Nathan no longer referred to the compliance lock as a punishment. He called it a lesson in governance during one internal strategy session I overheard from the hallway. He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. One evening, He brought out the original post-nuptial agreement binder and set it on the dining table. "I finally read it," he said. I sat across from him. "Clause 13, he continued. "It doesn't accuse. It protects." Yes. I signed it thinking it was symbolic. It was structural. He ran his fingers along the margin notes in my handwriting. "You were always thinking ahead." "I was always stabilizing." He nodded. "I thought that made you passive." It made me prepared. The difference between those words felt enormous. Later that week, the board formally concluded the expanded audit phase. Oversight would remain for 12 months. But active compliance holds were lifted. Dual authorization remained permanent. No return to unilateral control. Nathan accepted it without protest. The Florida project broke ground at a reduced scale in early fall. There were no press releases boasting record expansion. Just a modest announcement about responsible growth. I attended the small groundbreaking ceremony from a distance, standing near the back of the crowd. Nathan's speech was shorter than usual. "We're building with transparency and shared oversight," he said. "Growth is strongest when structure supports it." He didn't look at me, but I felt it. That night, we returned home and sat quietly in the living room. "Do you regret enforcing the clause?" he asked. "No." "Do you regret staying?" he asked next. "I considered that." "I'm not staying," I said. "I'm choosing alignment." He absorbed that. "And if I break structure again?" "You won't," I said calmly. He didn't challenge the certainty. Weeks earlier, he had boarded a plane believing expansion required speed and secrecy. Now he understood it required disclosure and consent. Not because I punished him, because I stopped absorbing the risk he created. I walked into the dining room and opened the small box of anniversary candles one last time. 5 remained unlit. Nathan stood in the doorway watching. "You're not going to light them," he said. "No," I replied. He nodded. "We didn't need ceremony. We needed structure." Outside, the city moved steadily, traffic flowing, lights shifting, buildings standing firm against the wind off the lake. Nothing spectacular had collapsed. No public disgrace. No dramatic explosion. Just a quiet narrowing of unchecked power. Nathan stepped closer. "I didn't see this coming," he said again. I looked at him evenly. "You never read the fine print." This time, he almost smiled. Winter came early that year. Chicago's skyline looked sharper against the gray sky, as if the city itself had been outlined with intention. The Florida project moved forward at a slower, steadier pace. No headlines about aggressive expansion. No glossy promises of global dominance. Just construction cranes rising deliberately against the cold. Nathan worked differently now. Board packets were circulated days in advance. Capital disbursement forms came to me before execution. He asked questions he used to answer alone. "Does this exposure look balanced to you?" he asked one evening, sliding a document across the dining table. I read it carefully. "Yes," I said. "If the projections remain conservative, they will..." The word no longer sounded like a declaration. It sounded like commitment. Jennifer disappeared from the periphery of our lives entirely. No more tagged photos. No more strategic captions. Her firm had repositioned itself with other clients. The European expansion narrative became a closed chapter in archived files. Not scandal, just correction. The Oversight Committee completed its 3rd review without incident. Liquidity ratios stabilized. Investor confidence recovered gradually. Not dramatically. That's how trust returns. Not in leaps, in increments. One evening, I found Nathan in his office staring at the original compliance notice framed on his desk. "You framed it?" I asked. He nodded. "It reminds me what happens when momentum outruns structure." I stepped closer. "It reminds me that structure works," I said. He looked at me. "You didn't destroy anything," he said quietly. "I never intended to. You forced accountability. I allowed it. The distinction mattered." Weeks turned into months. The dual authorization requirement became routine. What once felt restrictive now felt standard. The board no longer questioned every decision. They questioned alignment. Nathan no longer resented that. He respected it. At the hospital, I continued my shifts the same way I always had, monitoring, stabilizing, anticipating complications before they escalated. I realized that was all I had done at home. 2. Anticipated collapse. Stabilized before it became irreversible. On the anniversary of the Paris trip, not our wedding anniversary, but the day he boarded that flight, I stood in the kitchen alone again. The house was quiet. I opened the small box of candles. All 20 were there now. I had replaced the ones I lit weeks ago. Nathan walked in and paused when he saw them on the counter. "You're lighting them this time?" he asked. "No," I said softly. I closed the box. "I don't need to mark what's over," I added. "I need to honor what's aligned." He stepped closer. "I thought expansion meant escape," he admitted. "I didn't realize it meant exposure." "It always does," I said. He nodded. The waterfront project completed its first phase that spring. It wasn't as grand as originally planned. It wasn't as leveraged. It was stable. During the small investor update event, Nathan spoke plainly. "Growth without transparency is risk," he said. "Governance isn't limitation. It's protection." He didn't credit me publicly. He didn't need to. When we returned home that evening, he placed a folder on the table. "Updated governance charter," he said. "Permanent dual oversight. No exceptions." I read the final paragraph. All high-level capital allocations required documented co-trustee acknowledgement. No ambiguity. No acceleration without consent. I signed it. Not as retaliation. As alignment. That night, as the city lights reflected against the lake outside our windows, Nathan turned to me. "I didn't see it coming," he said once more. "You never read the fine print," I replied. But this time, there was no accusation in my voice. Just truth. I learned something through all of it. Revenge isn't always fire. Sometimes it's structure. Sometimes it's the quiet moment when you stop absorbing consequences for someone else's ambition. Sometimes it's simply refusing to shrink to preserve the illusion of harmony. Nothing collapsed. No empire burned. But unchecked power narrowed. And in that narrowing, balance returned. If you've ever found yourself standing alone in a room full of unlit candles, wondering whether silence makes you weak, remember this. Structure is not cruelty. Accountability is not betrayal. And sometimes the strongest move isn't destruction, it's documentation. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Have you ever had to choose structure over silence? Stay with us for more stories about hidden power, family drama, and the quiet strength that changes everything. And if you believe alignment is stronger than revenge, subscribe and keep watching. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.